Hey, third and fourth graders. Today has been a busy day. I tried a new cookie recipe. Oh my goodness, let me tell you, it was a winner. It had a Rolo in the middle and it kind of tasted like a brownie, but it was a cookie. Woo! I will be keeping that recipe. Hopefully the next time I see you, I can bake for you and bring them in. That'd be so much fun. But today, we're gonna take a little break from baking and do some reading. So grab your favorite stuffed animal. You know I got socks here. And curl up because it's time for the next chapter. Also, my last video in chapter 9 got a little bit cut off at the end, so I'm going to read you the last paragraph from the previous chapter. What happens to them? Insisted Milo. Oddly enough, they often grow 10 times the size of everyone else, said Alec thoughtfully. And I've heard that they walk among the stars. And with that, he skipped off once again toward the waiting woods. Chapter 10, A Colorful Symphony. As they ran, tall trees closed in around them and arched gracefully toward the sky. The late afternoon sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, sliding along the branches and down the trunks, and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches. A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch. Alec raced ahead, laughing and shouting, but soon encountered serious difficulties. For while he could always see the tree behind the next one, he could never see the next one itself and was continually crashing into it. After several minutes of wildly dashing about, they all stopped for a breath of air. I think we're lost, panted the humbug, collapsing into a large berry bush. Nonsense, shouted Alec from the high branch on which he sat. Do you know where we are? Asked Milo. Certainly, he replied. We're right here on this very spot. Besides, being lost is never a matter of not knowing where you are. It's a matter of not knowing where you aren't. And I don't care at all about where I'm not. This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it to himself when Alec said, If you don't believe me, ask the giant. And he pointed to a small house tucked neatly between two of the largest trees. Milo and Tok walked up to the door, whose brass nameplate simply read, The Giant, and knocked. Good afternoon, said the perfectly ordinary-sized man who answered the door. Are you the giant? Asked Tok doubtfully. I sure am, he replied proudly. I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you? Are we lost? Asked Milo. That's a difficult question, said the giant. Why don't you go around back and ask the midget? And he closed the door. They walked to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked at the door, whose nameplate read, The Midget. How are you? Inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant. Are you the midget? Asked Tok again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Unquestionably, he answered. I'm the tallest midget in the world. May I help you? Do you think we're lost? Repeated Milo. That's a very complicated problem, he said. Why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man? And he, too, quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very much like the front and the back, and the door flew open the instant they knocked. Can you guess what's going to happen? How nice of you to come by, exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother. You must be the fat man, said Tok, learning not to count too much on appearance. I'm the thinnest one in the world, he replied brightly. But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man on the other side of the house. Just as they suspected, the other side of the house looked the same as the front, back, and the side, and the door was again answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. What a pleasant surprise, he cried happily. I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember. How long is that? Asked Milo. I'm sure I don't know, he replied. Now pardon me, I have to answer the door. But you just did, said Tok. Oh yes, I'd forgotten. Are you the fattest thin man in the world? Asked Tok. Do you know anyone who's fatter? He asked impatiently. I think you're all the same man, said Milo emphatically. Shh, he cautioned, putting his fingers to his lips and drawing Milo closer. Do you want to ruin everything? You see, to tall men, I'm a midget, and to short men, I'm a giant. To skinny ones, I'm a fat man, and to the fat ones, I'm a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once. As you can see, though, I'm neither tall, nor short, nor fat, nor thin. In fact, I'm quite ordinary. But there are so many ordinary men that no one asks their opinion about anything. Now, what's your question? Are we lost? Asked Milo again. Said the man, scratching his head. I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It slipped my mind. Milo asked the question for the 5th time. My, the man mumbled. I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost. For on many occasions, where you're going is exactly where you are. On the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone. And since it's much more difficult to find your way back from some place you've never left, I suggest you go there immediately and then decide. If you have any more questions, please ask the giant. And he slammed the door and pulled down the shade. I hope you're satisfied, said Alec when he'd returned from the house and bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off more slowly this time in the direction of a large clearing. How many people live here in the forest? Asked Milo as they trotted together. Oh, yes, they live in a wonderful city called Reality, he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. It's right this way. In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared. The rooftops shone like mirrors, the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. Is that it? Shouted Milo, running toward the shining streets. Oh, no, that's only illusions, said Alec. The real city is over there. What are illusions? Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. Illusions, explained Alec, are like mirages. And realizing this didn't help much, he continued, and mirages are things that aren't really there that you can see very clearly. How can you see something that isn't there? Yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are, he said. For instance, if something is there, you can see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. But that's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones. Then where is reality? Barked Tock. Right here, cried Alec, waving his arms. You're standing right in the middle of Main Street. They looked around very carefully. Tock sniffed suspiciously at the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane at the air. But there was nothing at all to see. It really is a very pleasant city, said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights, which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to passers-by. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted around and down the non-existent streets and in and out of missing buildings. I don't see any city, Milo said softly. Neither do they, Alec remarked sadly, but it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all. It must be very difficult to live in a city that you can't see, Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. Not at all, once you get used to it, said Alec, but let me tell you how it happened. And they strolled along the bustling and busy avenue, and he began. Many years ago, on this very spot, there was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting spaces, and no one who lived here was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and the people would often stop and look at them. Didn't they have any place to go? Asked Milo. To be sure, continued Alec, but as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between, and they took great pleasure in doing just that. Then, one day, someone discovered that if you walked as fast as possible and looked at nothing but your shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon, everyone was doing it. They all rushed down the avenues and hurried along the boulevards, seeing nothing of the wonders and beauties of their city as they went. Milo remembered the many times he'd done the very same thing, and as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street that he couldn't remember. No one paid any attention to how things looked, and as they moved faster and faster, everything grew uglier and dirtier, and as everything grew uglier and dirtier, they moved faster and faster. And at last, a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away, until at last it was entirely invisible. There was nothing to see at all. What did they do? The humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in things. Nothing at all, continued Alec. They went right on living here, just as they'd always done, in the houses they could no longer see, and on streets which had vanished because nobody noticed a thing. And that's the way they've lived to this very day. Hasn't anyone told them? Asked Milo. It doesn't do any good, Alec replied, for they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to look for. Why don't they live in illusions? Suggested Humbug. It's much prettier. Many of them do, he answered, walking in the direction of the forest again. But it's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't there as it is to live in one where what you don't see is. Perhaps someday you can have one city as easy to see as illusions and as hard to forget as reality, Milo remarked. That will happen when you bring back rhyme and reason, said Alex, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plans. Now, let's hurry or we'll miss the evening concert. They followed him quickly to a flight of steps which couldn't be seen and through a door which didn't exist. In a moment they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens to find their way home, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their places. Here we are, cried Alec, and with a sweep of his arms, he pointed toward an enormous symphony orchestra. Isn't it a grand sight? There were at least 1,000 musicians ranged in a great arc before them. To the left and right were the violins and cellos, whose bows moved in great waves. And behind them, in numberless profusion, the piccolos, flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, and tubas were all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments, and lastly, in a long lineup, one side of the steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and long, pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements which seemed to start at his toes and work slowly up through his body and along his slender arms and finally end at the tips of his graceful fingers. I don't hear any music, said Milo. That's right, said Alec. You don't listen to this concert. You watch it. Now, pay attention. And we're going to stop in the middle of the chapter for this one. So join me tomorrow to see more and hear more about this colorful symphony. See you later.